So we'll get started with a new website template from Replit. And I'm just going to add a couple of Mad Libs questions to get started. And then I'll go over a couple of new concepts that we're going to start to use. So I'm just going to click our big blue Create Replit button here. And I'm going to use the regular HTML, CSS, JavaScript one. Sometimes it recommends like the auto refresh. I don't really like that one. You're obviously welcome to use it if you want to, but I find it kind of annoying. I like to just refresh it when I need to refresh it. And I'm going to call this our Mad Libs, and let's call this version 1. We might make some multiple versions. And I'm going to create a new Replit. And so just like last week, when we create a new Replit, it's going to make an HTML, JavaScript, and CSS page for us, which is good. We need all of those things, and it fills in some stuff for us. It like connects our style sheet. That's really useful. It sets up a few meta tags that are useful for building a website. So it is actually quite useful. It connects our script for us. So we're just going to leave most of those things the same. I'm going to take out this hello world. That's just kind of an example of where the content goes. We don't need that. And then I'm going to take out this little Replit badge that shows up on their websites. Just for our purposes, it's really not very necessary. And then I'm going to do a couple more things before I get started building out my HTML. I'm going to open the new tab window in the preview that's here. And I'm almost always going to use this instead of the web view, because if I turn off the web view, I have more space to look at my code and my markup. And I can also put two scripts next to each other like this. And that makes it easy to kind of see how my JavaScript and my HTML or my CSS relate. So that's how I tend to work when I'm working on a website. I'll have a couple documents open, and then I'll have a separate window with the preview so I can go look at the changes that I've made. So you guys may have a different setup. Whatever you prefer is going to be fine, but that's what I tend to do. And then the next thing I'm always going to do if I'm working on a web project is I'm going to open up my developer tools. So in Chrome, this is in different places depending on your browser, but in Chrome, we can go to the menu and go to Tools and go to Developer Tools. You can also go to View up here and Developer and go to JavaScript Console. And then there's some tabs up here where you can go between Elements, which is our HTML, CSS, and Console, which is our JavaScript. And I'm always going to have this open when I'm working, because when I'm working in JavaScript, if I make a typo or if I do something, if I make some type of error, it'll show up here. And so that'll help me kind of understand if something's not working before I notice that it's not working sometimes. Okay, so let's build out our HTML first. So I'm going to go back to my Replit tab, and I'm just going to close the sidebar so I can just see only my HTML and JavaScript. Although I'm not writing JavaScript right now. We are going to write some in a second. So in the body section, as usual, when I'm creating a website, I'm almost always going to start with a container for the content so that I can change the layout of the content on the page. So I can center it or add a grid or do other things like that. So I'll almost always start a new HTML page with div ID equals container. Sometimes people use wrap because it's like a wrapper around the site. So you'll see that sometimes. But I like to use container. And then I'll just close that div. And then most of the website content is going to go inside there. So for my Mad Libs project, I'm going to have like a little title. And then one of the things I'm going to do today, which you don't have to do in your final version of this project, but as an example of how we can actually interact with CSS and HTML, I'm going to show one question for our Mad Libs at a time. And then I'm going to use JavaScript to hide those questions and bring up new questions. So I'm just going to do that with a couple examples. So I'll start with an H1. Oh, and the way I did that, I don't know if I've talked about this. One of the shortcuts that's nice to use in Replit is if I type the name of the element that I want, for example, H1, and then I hit the tab key on the keyboard, it'll make the rest of those the syntax for me. So it'll make the opening and closing tag, and it'll make all the little brackets that I need. So that's what I actually do a lot when I'm writing HTML. Different people obviously have different preferences. So this is going to be Mad Libs. And so we're going to ask a couple questions. So actually, I'm going to do a paragraph, although it doesn't seem to work for paragraph. There we go. I must have moved the cursor. Okay, so let's do a paragraph. So I wrote P and hit tab, and we're going to collect some information about the user. So I'll just kind of introduce that. So input some let's get a name, place, and I'll just start with name and place. You guys can add some other parameters, or you can change those. And the program will generate a story. So I'm just going to do 2 as an example, but you guys can go from there and add more. So for my inputs, I'm going to have them in separate divs so I can hide them and then bring in the new input. So I'm going to start with a div, and so the ID of this div, so each one is going to have its own ID so that I can change it in my JavaScript. So for the first div, I'm going to call this name div, or I could call it name container. Either one of those is fine. I'm just going to call it name div because it's kind of shorter. If I start writing container next to everything, it's going to take a while. But either one of those is fine. So I'm just going to call this name div. And so inside each one, I'm going to have a prompt, and then an input box, and then a button to submit. So my prompt will be input your name, and that's in a paragraph tag. And then I'll have an input, and when I hit tab, Replit fills in that type equals text. So again, the way that I'm doing that is I'm writing the tag that I want, and when I hit tab on the keyboard, Replit will kind of fill in some basic stuff for me. And so the input, I just need to give it an ID so that I can get it in my JavaScript. So I'm going to call this name input. And then I need a button to submit this name. So I'm going to type in button, and I'll just write submit. Or you could write like next, something like that. And then this ID will be name button. So that's one question, and you could have other stuff in there, like you could have an image, you could have different types of input, like you could have that drop down that we looked at last time. You could have radio buttons. There's all sorts of different inputs that you could use there, but I'm just going to go with a basic text input. So I'm just going to copy and paste this for my next question. You could rewrite it. Either way is fine. If you rewrite it, you're less likely to forget to change stuff, which can lead to errors. But copying and pasting obviously takes less time. So for this one, this is going to be my place div. So I'll just change name to place. And instead of input your name, I'll say input a place. And for my input here, instead of name input, I'll have place input. And for my input button or my next button, I'll put place button. So you might think this is starting to look really repetitive, and it kind of is. And there are better ways to do things like this that are more efficient. But since we're just starting to learn programming, we're going to do things in a sort of basic way so that we can kind of like practice doing similar things. And also so that there's a lot of, if we wanted to do it more efficiently, we'd have to learn more complex structures, and that takes time. So we're going to stick with the basics for now. Okay, so let's take a look at our HTML, and then we'll write some code. So there's our HTML. We have our header, and then this little intro, and then input your name, input a place, and we have our inputs. Okay, so I'm gonna grab references to everything, just like we did last time, and then set it up so that we can get these inputs. So I'm going to put a little comment to start my program. I'm going to call this Mad Libs program by Owen, and I'll put the date here. You don't have to do this, but I like to do this stuff so when I go back and look at it, I can understand where it's from and what it is and what's going on. And so I'm just going to say example of 2 inputs for a Mad Libs story. Okay. So first we need to get references to our HTML. So I'll say get references to HTML. After we get our references to our HTML, so when I'm creating a new program, I'll often go through what are the steps of the program and write those down before I start to actually code stuff, so I can start to kind of plan out what is the program going to actually do, so I can kind of look ahead a little bit and try to make sure I have everything that I need. So once I get references to the HTML, set up events to get user input, and then eventually I'm going to display a story with user values. So for the HTML references, just as this is kind of a review from last week, we're going to store our references in variables. Variables are just like shorthands for pieces of data. So I'm going to create a variable by typing var, and then I'm going to name it something that describes what it does. So you can name it anything you want, but it should make it clear what it's for. So for this one, I'm going to have a name div, and that I'm just going to connect to this ID, and that's so I can hide it when I'm ready to hide it later. So then I use the equal sign to assign what I want this to be. Whoa, what was that? Was that me? Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the goblins from the story is trying to get to us. Okay, so the name div, we're going to reference the div that has all this stuff in it. And the main reason we're doing that is so we can hide it once the user has put this in. So our name div, and we're going to use the document, which gives us all of the HTML. And we're going to use get element by ID to get a specific element. And then in the parentheses, for our argument or parameter, we use quotation marks to get the ID of this div. So this is name div. And then at the end, I put a semicolon. So then we're going to repeat this a bunch of times. So again, you can type or copy and paste. So we also need our input. So name input is document.get element by ID, name dash input. And I'm going to make this a little bit wider just so we can see everything. Then our name button. Name button. So then I'm going to repeat all of that again for my place. So again, it's pretty repetitive, and there are more efficient ways to do this, but doing it in a more efficient way also means knowing more complex programming structures that we don't know yet. So for now, we're just going to copy and paste. And one thing I can do if I want to save myself a little time, I'm going to copy this. And since this has the exact same structure, something I can do in Replit or most text editors, if I select all of this, I can go up here and let's see. I don't see it here actually. Where do they put this? Maybe I'm just going to try Command F. Or no. Where do they put? There's a way that you can do a find and replace. So you can replace the individual parts. Oh, maybe it's in here now. Modify. Okay, so see where it says rename all occurrences? It looks like this has a key command F2. So I can rename name or wait. No, maybe that doesn't do. Usually it's called find and replace. This shouldn't be this hard, but it's in a different menu. Let's see. Can I find references? I guess this is just like weird AI stuff now. What happened to my regular menu? Let's go over here. Okay, maybe I can do it here. No. Okay. So that menu is gone now. They replaced it with like an AI thing, so I'll have to look at that later. But let's just do it real quick, and then I'll find that later. Okay, so let's just replace each instance of name with place, and I can just like double click on that, double click there, double click there. We'll just do this really quickly. So we have the exact same thing. We have a place div, a place input, and a place button. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look for when the user clicks the button, and then we'll move from one question to the next. And one of the things that we're going to do in order to make that work is we're going to hide the questions and then reveal them. And so that's actually a combination of JavaScript and CSS. And there's a lot of different ways to do this, but we'll see how to, both ways to do it. So if I open up my style sheet, I haven't used this yet, but if I say something like ID, or let's say div ID place dash div, I can set this to be invisible if I say display is none. And so now when I reload the page, I'm just going to see the first input. So I can change that in CSS, but in CSS I can't react to user events. So I can't show something after a user has clicked a button or hide something after a user has clicked a button. So that's something I have to do with JavaScript. So that's what we're going to look at now. Later we're also going to add a check to make sure that the user actually put something in. But that's a different concept that we haven't talked about, so we're going to learn that in the second part of class. So now I'm just going to set up one of my buttons. I'm going to say name button dot add event listener. So we talked about this last week. This is the way that I can listen for a user click. So there's two parameters for a user click, or for an event. There's the event that we're looking for. In this case, it's just a click. And then there's the function that we use to react to that event. So we'll call this function getName. Okay, so then we have to create that function. So we'll say function getName. And when we create a function, we, like VAR, we use function as the keyword. We can call the function whatever we want, but we want to make it make sense as far as what it does. Then we have the parentheses at the end, and we have a curly bracket for a new code block. So this new code block only happens when the event happens, in this case a click. So for now, when we get the name, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to hide the name div. So the way that we can change the CSS of an HTML element through JavaScript, all three of our languages coming together, we're going to say name div dot style. This gives us access to all the CSS properties of this HTML element. And then we're going to choose the display property, and we're going to assign it a value. We're going to say none. So notice how this looks very similar to our CSS. Just like in CSS, which selects a div, and then it has a property and a rule. Here we're doing the same thing, but we're using JavaScript. So it's a slightly different syntax, but this is the way that they can talk to each other. So let's test this, and then we'll add a couple more things. So once I input my name, I should be able to click on the next button, and that question goes away, and now we can go to our next question. And if we look at what happened in elements, you can see here, this name div, we added this style display none through our JavaScript. So that's one of the things that JavaScript is useful for. It's changing what we see on the page after it's already loaded, which we can't really do with HTML or CSS. Okay, so we hide the name div. Now we want to show the place div. So we're going to take our place div. We're going to do the exact same thing, except now we're going to say displays block. And block is one of many different types of displays that we can use to show the div here. Block just happens to be the default for a div element. So now if I click this button, now notice that the HTML changes. It looks like it just changes the text, but actually all of that HTML is this new div, and that old div, the name div, is gone now. And then actually that's all we need to do for now, because now we're still going to be able to access the value from the input, but we're going to do that a little bit later. But really all this does is it moves to our next question. Okay, so let's do the same thing, and then you can, the way you order this is really up to you. Syntactically, the way that I would do this is I would say place button, and then I would put my function below the next function, but you can really organize it however you want. So I'm going to say place button dot add event listener, and click, and then we're going to say get place. And then for our get place function, for now, we're just going to hide the place div. So we're going to say place div dot style dot display equals none. Okay, so now if I click these buttons, we can answer our questions and we can move on to our response. There's a few other things that we want to do. You guys can, for your Mad Libs, you can add a few more. So that's kind of the template, and then you can kind of chain them together and go from there. I'm going to just quickly add a response so that we can have that, so it doesn't just end with nothing. And then I'm going to add a little bit of styling, and then we'll save some more stuff for later. So I'm going to add a response div down here. I'm going to say div ID is response. And that's actually all I'm going to have in there. I'm just going to put some text in there as my response. So in style.css, well, actually, if there's no content in here, we won't be able to see it anyway. So I don't really need to change anything in the CSS there. Okay, so when we get our response, we're gonna say, or we need to get a reference to the response first, actually. So I'm gonna go back up to my HTML references. I'm going to say variable response div is document dot get element by ID. I don't know, at some point Replit stopped filling this stuff in for me. I don't know if I broke something, but anyway, we're just going to call this response, since that matches the HTML over here. And I'm not going to fill in the whole Mad Lib for now, but I'm just going to say response.inner or .text content. This will add some text to the response, and I'll say hi, and I'll say name input .value, and then I'll add a period at the end. So just a little response. I'm not even doing the whole story, but for now I'm just showing that we finished this part of it. So we're going to say hi. This is just a string, so it's just some text, which is why it's in quotation marks. And then we add, we're using plus name input dot value. So that'll take our name input and it'll put whatever's there. And then there's a period at the end just to make it look like a sentence. So now if I go here and I say Owen and go to next, and I put a place is New York and go to next, it just says hi Owen. So that response kind of shows us that, you know, this thing is working. Okay, since we're doing some CSS, let's throw the styles over here. Let's just add a couple more styles just so it looks a little bit better. So I'm going to say the body, let's put a background color. Maybe light blue will be nice. Okay, and let's put a font family. Say font family, and let's do Comic Sam's. Okay, that looks good. And then let's do a couple styles on the container. That's really all I need to make this look a little bit better. And then we'll do some other stuff as well later. So we'll say container. I'll say width. I'm going to make it pretty small because there's not that much content. So I'll say the width is like maybe 480 pixels, and margin, as usual, 0 auto. And that's going to make our website nice and centered and make our content a little bit smaller. And yeah, that looks a little bit better. Maybe we'll give it a nice color. I'm going to test out a color here. So let's select the body, say color is blue. And let's see if we can find a nicer color, something like that. Looks pretty good. So I'll copy that. And we'll do a text color. So I'll say color. There we go. Okay. So that's it for now. I'll put a link to this project so you guys can see this when I post the video. And in the next part of class, after our break, what we're going to do is add in something that makes sure that the users actually put something in the inputs, because right now I can just click through this without actually doing anything. And that doesn't create an error, but it makes our program not work the way that we want it to. So that's what we'll work on in the second part of class.